Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the inaugural lecture for our spring program. It's wonderful to see such a full house. And I particularly want to extend a warm welcome. We have a group of international scholars here tonight. I don't know how many people here know the intricacies of the art history discipline, but last week was our annual Cartilage Art Association conference, and a group of scholars from around the world came to the conference, and right now we're hosting them at the Clark, and it has been such a pleasure for us over the past couple days to discuss art history and their projects with them, and it has truly been an expansive experience, and I'm so grateful that they are all here with us tonight. It is my pleasure tonight to introduce Susan Sidlauskas, who is professor at Rutgers University. She's a scholar of the long 19th century, and she examines this period not only in relationship to art history, but also the history of medicine, philosophy, and gender studies. She has held numerous fellowships, including at the Columbia Society of Fellows, the Getty Research Institute, and most recently, Sidlauskas was a Guggenheim Fellow in 2014. In her 2009 book, Cézanne's Other, The Portraits of Hortense, also a winner of the Motherwell Book Award, Sidlauskas offered an extraordinarily insightful description of her own method, in which she remarks that, quote, "In our age of inattention to history and impatience with details, she hopes to promote a kind of art history that is at once historically responsible, theoretically grounded, and visually convincing." Indeed, this is the beauty of Sidlauskas' work, united by an attention to formal structure, composition, and material, a mastery of visual reading complemented by an equally profound attention to the specificity of the historical moment. The foundation for her exemplary art historical work may be seen in her first book, Body, Place, and Self in 19th Century Painting, published with Cambridge University Press in 2000. This book also, I imagine, established a foundation for her lecture tonight, as it contains an extraordinary probing chapter on Sargent's famous painting of the daughters of Edward Darley-Bois, a chapter dedicated to a close reading of a single work in relationship to childhood psychology, Sargent's own childhood, and a consideration of the liminal state of adolescence in its march towards self-knowledge. Yet the piece that I would most recommend today, and especially to this audience, which is also composed of graduate students in the MA program, that I encountered is a piece that Sidlauskas published in the Rutgers Art Review entitled "On Graduate Education, Is It Worth It?" And I have to say, this has become a genre of art historical writing in which tenured faculty write to aspiring PhD students about whether or not it's worth it. And and I find that Susan's was by far in this genre the most thoughtful and honest and lovely, I thought, consideration of what it means to pursue a PhD in art history. And I will end with her defense of pursuing a PhD in art history, in which she acknowledges that the kind of, and to quote her, "the kind of nuanced, multi-layered, deep, prolonged looking we learn to do as art historians is a form of feeling. That necessary combination of intellectual rigor and imaginative interpretation enables us to envision cultures, historical moments, and lives very different from our own. We need not give up feeling for thinking. In the best art history, they are always intertwined." I have no doubt that this evening, Sidlauskas will convey the ability of thoughtful and provocative scholarship to not only make us think, but also to feel. Please join me in welcoming her.
Absolutely the best introduction. I will probably ever receive in my entire life. Thank you. And thank you all for coming. It's a great pleasure to be here. I am determined to finish a draft of this book before I leave Williamstown. That is my goal. I'm going to plunge right in. Tonight, I am offering you a section of a book in progress called John Singer Sargent and the Physics of Touch, a title which I realize needs some explaining. And I also want to explain, these are the paintings I'm writing about, and I want to explain why this painting on the left, Jean Hamilton, is shown twice. It's because she's in process of being cleaned, and I didn't want to diminish how lovely she's going to look eventually. So this is Becca Helen, whom some of you may know because she was here at the Clark a couple of years ago. She wrote an absolutely brilliant essay on Sargent and his materials. So that's the explanation. The book concentrates on 12 later portraits by Sargent, one of which is the principal subject of tonight's talk. I am arguing that Sargent's most ambitious portraits of these years are unexpectedly original modern works, and their maker a master transformer of the physical matter of paint. For a variety of reasons, Sargent was exquisitely attuned to the visceral experience of maneuvering through society, to which he did not fully belong, during the period that has come to be known as the, quote, restless universe of the late 19th century. Physicist Max Born coined this phrase in 1927 to describe the explosive pace of scientific discovery in chemistry, biology, and physics that occurred during these years. As Michael Faraday discovering the magnetic field, the very shape of the universe changed, no longer understood as a void of floating particles. The universe was instead composed of continuous matter possessed of kinetic energy. In other words, everything was connected, many believed by the invisible but all-present ether, and everything was moving, a state of flux that extended to every stratum of life during this decade. Sargent's domain may have been the upper reaches of late Victorian and Edwardian society, and not the cosmos governed by natural forces. But the world he moved through with such skill was roiled by upheavals as potent and transformational in their own way as the great imponderables, the name given to magnetism, electricity, and gravity, that so riveted scientists during these years. British writer and editor Holbrook Jackson summed up the character of 1890s England as a site of perpetual motion on all fronts. Quote, the decade of 1,000 movements, he called it, but with everyone running in different directions. The language of volatility was woven through political, scientific, literary, philosophical, and artistic discourse, and filtered into Sargent's own circle. His childhood friend, Vernon Lee, her nom de plume, she was born Violet Paget, a devotee of the influential philosopher Walter Pater, asked, and here's her quote, when, I wonder, she wrote like that, very theatrically, will the forces within us be recognized as natural in the same sense as those without, in our souls as part of the universe, prospering or suffering according to which of its rhythms they vibrate to? This became commonplace for poets and philosophers to invoke the unseen but mighty forces of the universe to describe emotional states, and scientists used myths and allegories to identify and to conceptualize their discoveries. James Maxwell's demon is being one of the most famous, and apparently relevant again with the development of nanotechnology, which I would be happy to answer questions about, although my knowledge is reasonably limited. Keep in mind that anybody who rode a train, crossed the ocean on a steamship, purchased a manufactured piece of clothing, or sent a telegram was reaping the fruits of scientific experimentation, whether knowingly or not. Certainly the nomadic family in which Sargent was raised, traveling around Europe according to the seasons, with never quite enough money to settle into one place, took great advantage of every convenience that industrialization had to offer. Energy science, the precursor to modern physics, has helped me to make sense of what I believe to be the most experimental work of a man whose friends and family regarded him as a veritable force of nature unto himself. Here he is in his studio. Kinetic energy incarnate. Notice he's got a brush in each hand. Visitors to Sargent's studio on Tite Street in Chelsea reported that the artist rushed around his studio in a, quote, white heat of activity, as if by motion alone he could effect the transformation of matter. The atmosphere in the studio was reportedly akin to the effect of colliding weather fronts. The electricity of a duel was in the air, noted one observer. Sargent's most arresting subjects appear to have possessed a restlessness, a force, an energy, if you will, that matched his own. In the words of a leading physicist at the time, the Scotsman Peter Guthrie Tait, who was a close collaborator and friend of James Maxwell's, the great characteristic of energy in relation to humankind was the fact that, quote, in general, we can readily transform it. In fact, it is of use to us solely because it can be transformed. Tait's optimism was appealing to a population made anxious about the efficacy of the human will. What was the human will going to be able to do, given both Darwin's theory of evolution and the sheer scale of the cosmic forces that were supposedly buffeting everyone about? Tait wanted to transmit his confidence about the possibilities for transformation to a large audience, not just to fellow scientists. He delivered engaging lectures to the public throughout Great Britain, some to women, some to the working man. Those were advertised separately. His books were published in many editions and circulated widely. Even Sargent owned Tait's book, Recent Advances in Physical Science, a gift from his father, these are illustrations, which the artist kept in his private library until his death. While I do not consider Sargent's ownership of this book a smoking gun, I do draw upon the concepts within this roughly contemporaneous science about matter and movement to characterize structures that are both pictorial and material, that appear to change as we behold them. In a half-century dominated by competing physical theories, I would argue that Sargent was living one of his own. Nearly everyone who came to know Sargent reasonably well in his middle age was struck by an inexplicable disjunction between the painter's commanding physical presence. He was 6 feet tall, burly, full-blooded, robust appetite. He drank a lot, he ate a lot, as everybody said. And here's an illustration, another one. I love that. So there he is, big, and a personal reticence so unshakable that the most tentative exchange of intimacy stopped before it began. The artist's nephew Francis once observed that his uncle was, quote, ever shy of emotion and inclined to shirk it when it came his way. He dwelled within a sort of protective network of repressions. The history of physics is admittedly an unexpected alliance for a painter only recently described as having, quote, squandered his gifts on painting socialites with effortless panache. That was written in the New York Times. I will not identify the critic for the time being. My hope is that this unusual pairing will render visible features of Sargent's later portraits that would remain otherwise unseen or dismissed as unthinking variations on his much-touted and deeply distrusted virtuosity. I disrupt the binaries of high modernism from which Sargent is generally exiled. Admission to that pantheon has generally improved, depended upon an artist's relevance to the origins of abstraction. But in fact, as Sargent challenged the separation of the social body from its material surrounds, he too was testing the breaking point of where figure ended and ground began, one of modernism's signature moves, as we know. As it happens, the wealthy, even titled subjects who interested Sargent most deeply were not as securely planted in their respective societies as we might assume, as their own accounts, diaries, letters, artwork, published and unpublished autobiographies and biographies, poetry and scrapbooks attest. Their social status did not insulate them completely from the taint of scandal, the shame of financial reversal, the anxiety of isolation, and the frustrations of desires unrealized, whether for love, artistic fulfillment, or power. Sargent was not interested in representing the interiority of his subjects. Instead, he pictured with great subtlety the strains, inconsistencies, and aspirations that constituted their social performances in the world, the costs of which the painter knew very well. Sargent effectively became the mediator for his subjects' encounters with the world. In their hands, their respective stances ranged from an energetic, even aggressive projection towards the viewer, such as we see here and here, with Mr. and Mrs. Phelps Stokes and Ina and Betty Wertheimer, to retreat and resistance. Mrs. Robert Harrison here, Elsie Palmer there. And I'm being reductive here, but to get the point across. And every shade of ambivalence between them. Sargent invented subtle and contradictory pictorial structures to represent a society whose authority was eroding. And he changed the way we see that society, for we become enmeshed, as its original subjects were, in the resistance to its unmaking. His compositions do not simply represent the volatile surfaces of social identity. They enact it through Sargent's energetic handling of the physical matter of paint. In 1890, in Nahant, a coastal town 14 miles north of Boston, John Singer Sargent made a painting known as Lady with a Blue Veil. The accessory of the title is wrapped around a straw boater hat, a tilt on the head of a woman who would be wearing a light summer dress if Sargent had finished painting it. Its subject, centered and monumentalized, the blue veil, as I will call it here, demands to be treated as a portrait, and yet perversely, most of the woman's face has been rendered invisible. As a rule, every profile hides a face in plain sight. But the layer of veiling that Sargent has inserted between us and his subject makes it nearly impossible to identify her features. The woman's limpid fingers are splayed at her throat, pressing the veil to keep it from flying away, or perhaps to loosen its stranglehold on her neck. If Sargent had wanted to paint a charming genre scene of a woman being blown about by gusts of wind, there were many less provocative ways to do it. The veils worn by Winslow Homer's female protagonists, for example, floated weightlessly behind them, whether they were grasping the reins of a horse-drawn carriage. You see the Civil War veteran on the left, absent his arm. Whether they were grasping the reins of a horse-drawn carriage or skating in Boston's public garden. Edward Manet outfitted the elegant women in the foreground of La Musique aux Tuileries of 1862 with veiled hats that are slightly obstructive, but the faces beneath them remain largely intact. Compared to Homer's and Manet's veils, Sargent's iteration resembles a shroud. Despite the summary presentation of the dress in the blue veil, the contour of the woman's body is unambiguous enough that it is unsettling to see that her torso has been sheared off at the waist. Even at half length, the figure looms, slightly larger than life. She arrogates most of the canvas, which otherwise teems with disorderly, even wild undulations of green, brown, and ochre paint. Presumably, this is a glimpse of nature on the hills of Nahant. However, there is nothing natural about this mass of paint strokes. Their seeming chaos quiets down only when they dissolve collectively into a narrow but distinctive band of mottled green and brown that rims the subject's entire form, from the crown of her boater hat to either side of her waist. There is a sensation that her figure is holding its own in spite of the pressure around it. The unfinish of the subject's upper body fails to soften her almost militaristic posture. Her torso faces the viewer as if at attention, but the head is turned sharply in profile, a marriage of exposure and aversion that Sargent had used 6 years earlier for his full-length portrait of Madame X, Virginie Avignon-Gautreau, and would employ again to very different effect in his painting of the conspicuously decorated but somehow unconfident Colonel Ian Hamilton. While the painting in question has long been known as the Blue Veil, or Lady with a Blue Veil, there has never been any doubt as to the identity of the subject. Sally Fairchild, called Sadie, spelled various ways, was the daughter of the Boston stockbroker and banker, he was Sargent's banker, Charles Fairchild, and his wife Lily, whom Sargent first came to know after Charles commissioned the artist to paint a portrait of Robert Louis Stevenson as a birthday present for his wife. By the time the Blue Veil was being painted, the artist's younger sister Violet and Sally had become close friends. Violet makes her cabinet card out to Sadie right there. Violet had been staying with the Fairchilds in their immense brownstone in Boston's Back Bay, while her brother was in New York, fulfilling and pursuing commissions. In August, the Fairchilds invited both the brother and sister to their summer cottage in Nahant, a fashionable and still geologically intriguing peninsula that juts into the ocean north of Boston. Photographs taken at that very summer of Sargent and members of the Fairchild family on the unmanicured hills there show the painter both amused and at ease. In one photograph, he winks for the camera. I love the caption, a wink. And I would never have known about this scrapbook, which is an extraordinary document in the Boston Athenaeum, if it hadn't been for Donna Lucy's book on Sargent's women. And then they let me photograph it with my phone, which was a big deal. Known for both her beauty and her brains, Sally was one of the first women permitted to attend William James's psychology and philosophy lectures at Harvard. Sally was reportedly separated from her male cohort by a screen. One cannot help but wonder about the degree of its transparency. James's magisterial Principles of Psychology was first published in the very year the Blue Veil was painted. Sally was also featured in the correspondence and autobiographies of George Bernard Shaw, Ellen Terry, and Bertrand Russell. Here is how the philosopher-mathematician remembered Sally. She was an aristocratic Bostonian of somewhat diminished fortunes, who I had first come to know in 1896 when we were staying in Boston. In the face, she was not strikingly beautiful, but her movements were the most graceful that I have ever seen. Innumerable people fell in love with her. It sounds as if Sargent, there's another picture of her. It sounds as if Russell was one of these admirers, for he admits that after spending time with Sally in 1899 in London, that he had never forgotten her. During the summer of 1890, the financial and health difficulties that would trouble her family several years later were nowhere on the horizon. The Fairchilds were enjoying all the benefits that accrued to Boston's most elite society. So what exactly did Sargent gain from suppressing the much-praised grace of Sally Fairchild, which is evident here only in the supple flexion of her fingers as they press against that irrepressible veil? By the summer of 1890, the painter and his subject knew one another quite well. They exchanged letters and conversations on books and music in particular. Perhaps the artist was more intrigued by the force of her personality than her feminine grace. The Blue Veil was not a commissioned portrait, so its apparent informality might seem unsurprising, evidence of the artist freed from the pressure to fulfill someone else's vision of how they should be displayed to the world. In fact, while he was painting the Blue Veil, Sargent was obliged to cross the hills to another summer cottage nearby in order to paint the Boston statesman Henry Cabot Lodge. Sargent's portrait of Lodge shows a pleasant-looking, youngish man in formal dress who appears to be gazing out a window towards the sea, fiddling with his watch fob. Lodge dominates the space he occupies, but neither his gaze nor his bodily presentation evoke the authority that he, in fact, already possessed by virtue of his stature as a member of Congress. Lodge was summed up by Richard Ormond as an embodiment of old Boston values and tradition, a man convinced of his own place in society and armed with an unassailable sense of his abilities and superiority. I think that comes through. The vigorous paint strokes and luminous color of the Blue Veil would be considered by many to be predictable displays of Sargent's fabled and empty-minded, and that is a quote by Lewis Mumford, the critic, virtuosity. But the painting's informality was actually highly constructed. The work's large scale and pictorial ambition demand a more comprehensive and nuanced interpretation, other than providing a release from the tedium of the Lodge portrait. The Blue Veil is one of Sargent's most radical paintings, and while this work is singular to some degree, it shares many characteristics with nearly a dozen later portraits that Sargent produced, mostly in and around London, with Sally's equivocal portrait being the geographical exception, between 1886 and 1907, which was the year that the artist declared publicly that he was forever done with what he referred to disdainfully as paw traits. Collectively, these paintings share a capacity for unexpected structural transformation, a sensation of force barely contained, and a visceral, provocative address to the viewer. In these works, Sargent delivers to us something that no other visual artist of the period does: the lived physical sensation of navigating that restless universe, in Max Born's words, of the fin de siècle. The most obvious way to make an argument for Sargent's modernity would probably be to ally him with the Impressionists, which would be perfectly appropriate, since he and Claude Monet were close friends, especially around the time when the Blue Veil was being painted. In fact, we have written testimony, the diary of Sally's younger sister Lucia, an aspiring artist, that Sargent expressed his enthusiasm for a particular Monet painting he had just seen in a gallery in Boston while he was in the midst of painting Sally. In 1885, Sargent had studied Monet's work habits on sight, capturing the Frenchman as he painted before his motif, Ne Giverny, accompanied by an unidentified woman, likely Monet's stepdaughter, Suzanne. In Sargent Claude Monet painting By the Edge of the Wood, the painting on the easel is quite easily recognizable as Monet's Meadow with Haystacks near Giverny, not only because of the cropped haystack on the left, but because the artist took pains to emulate the diagonal strokes of Monet's Sky in Progress. However, such visual and personal affinities between Monet and Sargent have at times reinforced a perception that the latter offered a kind of diluted impressionism, to borrow Elaine Kilmurray's phrase, for an audience unprepared to embrace the work of its most adventurous practitioners. The prejudice was reinforced by Roger Fry's scathing criticism of Sargent, which happened almost immediately after his death, and it persists to this day. Fry's contempt was part of his campaign to locate Sargent at the nadir to Paul Cézanne's zenith, the exemplar of everything modernism had left behind in the dust. Fry rather sheepishly admitted to his readers that he had at first been very enthusiastic about Sargent's Carnation Lily Lily Rose, considered by many to be the artist's most impressionistic painting. Excuse me one second. But shortly after Sargent's death, the critic repented his lapse in judgment and conceded that what thrilled us all then was the fact that this picture was the first feeble echo which came across the channel of what Monet and his friends had been doing with a far different intensity for 10 years or more. As others have amply demonstrated before me, in particular Elaine Kilmurray, while there was great affection and interest between Sargent and Monet, and a jointly run successful subscription campaign to keep Monet's Olympia in France, and the two of them were in charge of that, it is obvious that the two men had very different visions of their core subjects and methods. Monet was impassioned by the tumult and radiance inherent in nature, and how it could transform the surfaces of built structures, grain stacks, Rouen Cathedral, of which there is a gorgeous example in the Clark, of course, water lily gardens, and the Houses of Parliament in London, which was painted from a studio found for Monet at Sargent's request. And Monet and Sargent watched with an American writer whom Monet described him, the entirety of Queen Victoria's funeral, and he was struck by this man whom he was introduced to, a writer, but whom he forgot how detailed he was, how he knew everything. It turned out it was Henry James. So he got the blow-by-blow of Victoria's funeral by Henry James. It's amazing to imagine. For Cézanne, the central drama in his life was fundamentally a human one, the exertion demanded of the social performances he observed around him, and very importantly, by the precarity of the performers. In general, the group of subjects I'm concerned with tended to share not only Sargent's physical restlessness, but at least a passing acquaintance with the vulnerability, even shame, of not always conforming to the expectations of one's class or gender, family history, or religious faith. And who better suited to recognize and give visual form to these tensions than a painter of uncertain nation, ambiguous class, and masked sexuality? Writing in 1899, the British critic Marion Hepworth Dixon declared that to her mind, there was nobody better suited to represent the, quote, thousand perplexities and anxieties that loom up before the contemporary man and woman. Dixon believed that Sargent was acutely attuned to the era's special, subtle, and intangible character. For her, the painter was, quote, the most precise instrument the century has forged. Sargent did not so much reveal what was beneath the glittering surfaces of the Gilded Age as exploit their revelatory instability. The cosmopolitan son of a physician who authored and illustrated a widely read tract on bandaging, Sargent was as obsessed as any natural philosopher, which was what physicists were called in mid-century, with the mutability of matter. His students were dumbfounded at the amount of pigment he piled high upon his palette. Enough for 10 paintings, one marveled. Conservators who have studied his portraits have reported that Sargent handled paint as if it were a sculptural material, like wax or clay. He employed a palpably dense but silken paint as a kind of connective tissue, an infinitely pliable flesh that bound him to both his subjects and the world, not unlike the invisible but nonetheless, supposedly, present ether that was said to bind together everything in the universe, until Albert Einstein declared that it did not exist in 1905. Sargent undermined the distinctions among fabric, flesh, and paint with the pictorial equivalent of dissection and its counter-activities, masking, binding, suturing, folding, and wrapping, sometimes within the very same figure. The artist was not simply bearing witness to all the Gilded Age finery he painted, as is often presumed. He was engineering its pictorial disintegration through a process in which skin, hair, and fabric could dissolve at any moment, only to be reconstituted as other, more ambiguous substances. In his Principles of Psychology, William James reminded his readers that the self was a highly contingent construction. There were the spiritual and bodily selves at opposite ends of the spectrum, and in between and in flux were the extracorporeal material selves and the various selves in between. That's, I'm quoting James. Neither James in his text nor Sargent in his painting made much of a distinction between the natural and man-made layers that comprised the social body. Those material layers were multiple, interdependent, and constantly in motion. Anthropologist Daniel Miller has identified what he calls a depth ontology that underlies much of Western thought, the idea that anything meaningful must exist beneath the surface. If Sargent's painterly surfaces have often been dismissed as superficial exercises in virtuosity, I believe that it is in part because they have been identified with the fashionable dress of his subjects, to which, in fact, Sargent was indifferent, who have in turn been judged to be the scions of the British Empire or elite Boston society, at their most intemperate. I might say that I'm instead building an argument for what we might call Sargent's surface ontology. In other words, how to describe the composition of that surface and articulate what and how it means. As Miller puts it, clothing sets into relief the intrinsic materiality of what are otherwise regarded as social relations. Sargent may never have finished Sally's dress in the blue veil, but he did bestow an abundance of attention upon that veil in every surface it touches. The fabric ripples along the brim of the straw hat, almost opaque against the diagonal of the wide black ribbon. The knot of veiling at the back of the head sits just above an exposed coil of chestnut hair. This vivid and abrupt presence jars the eye, as if we have glimpsed a sight even more intimate than the subject's flesh. Ribbons of white trail down from the hair to hover at the jawline and remain distinct from the blue-violet film that thickens around the neck. The veil will not be contained, and a white stream shoots out from behind the subject's left arm. The essential role played by the wind in this effect confers upon the status of an agent. Even those undulating emerald, ochre, and chestnut-toned strokes, grasses, trees, snakes, pause only to edge the subject's perimeter, as if to pin her in place. I would contend that the blue veil is not simply about the gale of wind that had sprung up suddenly on the Nahant bluff where it was painted, or the unruly flora at its edges. Rather, the work is about a woman visibly struggling to stay upright in the face of elements that threaten to overpower her. Human force meets and resists its natural counterpart. Writing 3 decades ago, art historian Martha Kingsbury posed the question, did Sargent have a system? She also wondered, was it anything like Cézanne's, which would have been considered an absurd question by most people who read this. To Kingsbury's first question, I would respond with an unequivocal yes. To the second query, my answer is more than you might expect, or put another way, more than art history has allowed. Look again at the blue veil. Notice the area just below the eye. The sky blue accessory of the title is pulled back tightly enough here to meet the resistance of a ghostly, loosely painted nose. If we slide our gaze to the left, just about where Sally's right cheek would be, we can see that the ochre and pale crimson paint with which Sally denoted the subject's, which with Sargent denoted his subject's skin, is riding on top of the fabric of the veil. This willful confounding of the boundaries that in principle render distinct flesh, fabric, and paint is not simply a bravura display of the painter's impressive but hollow skill. It is a building block of the visual system he devised to capture a series of especially sympathetic subjects as they move through the rather pitiless society in which they circulated. In Sargent's hands, skins of paint could be made to act as porous membranes, as in Mrs. Robert Harrison of 86, sealed envelopes, Graham Robertson, the Tate of 94, or a connective web. This is Mrs. Carl Meyer and her children. In the portrait of Lord Ribblesdale, here's the first Lord Ribblesdale on the left, which that Lord Ribblesdale had to give up because of his father's gambling debts and suicide. I'm just mentioning that. In the portrait of Lord Ribblesdale, the fabric of the subject's rat-catcher coat, that is what it was called, and riding breeches alternately liquefies and hardens into rock. A flat, opaque surface gradually becomes a crystalline transparency in the dress worn by Jean Hamilton in her portrait. For the companion work of her husband, Colonel Ian Hamilton, Sargent set into motion an unremitting contest between the reddened abrasion of the colonel's weathered cheeks and the scarlet of his resplendent uniform. Also, I love the detail of this, where the metals are sort of peeking out of the cloak, which has so carefully been tucked behind. And Edith Phelps Stokes' starched white tennis skirt, which is what Sargent insisted she wear, comes towards us with the force of a boat at full sail. Sargent's unmatched ability to dissolve, fortify, thicken, pierce, multiply, gather, and pull apart the interpenetrating layers of these costumed figures conveyed the bodily experience of sensing and constructing the manifold contradictory layers of those ever-shifting social selves that William James had described. In so doing, Sargent, like James, made manifest a new kind of knowledge about the interdependence of bodily and social transformation. The artist's most ambitious realizations were concentrated on those particular subjects with whom he enjoyed a kind of mutual recognition, a near physical complicity that seems palpable to us even now as we stand before their portraits. In so doing, we not only uncover a picture of seismic cultural and economic change, we can sense something of its visceral effects across time and space. When we pause and linger before these paintings, our very presence seems to activate the process of transformation. For example, W. Graham Robertson's youth disappears as we move closer to his portrait. The faint suggestion of a 5 o'clock shadow, visible only when inches away from the painting, emerges to reveal the 30-year-old man he actually was. The longer we study Adele Meyer's dress, we realize that it is shot through with enough greens and violets to lend the fabric both weight and traces of a circulatory system. Helen Harrison seems in danger of being pierced by her own garment, so sharply chiseled are its surfaces. Inside this opaque crimson shell, Harrison's dress is painted as a semi-permeable, near translucent skin of varying thickness and penetrability. It's an extraordinary painting. And she was originally carrying a bouquet of red flowers, painted by Sargent when it was first shown, and he painted it out. The very presence of Sally Fairchild's veil could be considered a stinging rebuke to those yearning to catch a glimpse of the beautiful, fiercely intelligent young woman who was the object of so much admiration and apparently quite a bit of resentment. The veil is so prominent a feature, almost a miniature weather system that has for the moment settled around Sally's neck, that it distracts from the effort we must exert to see her. Sargent's portrayal balances on a razor edge between revelation and suppression. Consider how abruptly and illogically the veil that initially seems to overwhelm Sally's features dissolves into near transparency around her eye, affording us a glimpse of one of her most striking and indelible features, her distinctive brow, which is indeed prominent in contemporaneous photographs of her, especially in the profile view. Sargent seems to have reworked this area around the eye repeatedly, not so much to render the features more discernible, but to make them appear more actively directed. Sargent painted this portion of Sally's face with broad strokes of ochre, pale crimson, and blue violet, which both overlap and intersect at right angles. It becomes obvious that the brow and eyelid below are centered within a triangular wedge formed of yellow-gray, pale violet, and blue strokes, all edged with distinct lines of crimson and white. The apex of this horizontal wedge sits where we would imagine Sally's temple to be, suggesting a slightly displaced version of Euclid's cone of vision from his optics of 300 BC, in which the mathematician famously showed, incorrectly as it turned out, that vision emanated from the eye. Sargent's roughly painted but distinct triangle widens to encompass that eye and ends at the margin of her veil, whose now opaque edges create a firm border between the brown and green strokes. In addition to the broad sweep of pigment that Sargent uses to allude to Sally's cheek floating on top of the veil, as we saw, the streaks of paint that suggest her jawline appear to gather momentum as they move from left to right, sweeping right past where the nose and mouth would be. It is as if Sargent is striving to embed a sense of propulsion, or at least the potential for movement forward, in Sally's otherwise arrested figure. Her body may have come to a standstill, but her gaze is active and energetic, with the capacity to defy its frame. If the blue veil is not exactly a portrait, neither is it a more conventional genre painting, such as Manet's The Woman with the Round Hat. The fashionability of Manet's model, a significant preoccupation of the artist in the late 1870s and 80s, seems to be the subject of this work. Sorry, a winter cough I'm really trying to get rid of. The subject of this work, although the woman's features are distinct enough that we become curious as to whether it is possible to identify her. Although we can see a simplified notion of her black-rimmed eye in profile, her capacity to gaze through her veil seems, sorry about the purple lights, photographing it through glass, seems to have been partially obscured by Manet. Relatively loose diagonal and gray-brown strokes cohere into what appears to be a shade that sits atop the bridge of the subject's nose. Presumably this alludes to a fold in the veil that is attached to the round hat of the title. As Monet has painted it, however, this concentrated, darkened area almost mimics the practice within medical photography of placing a black bar over a subject's eyes to protect his or her identity while leaving the patient's body exposed and often nude. You've probably seen pictures like that. Monet's model, however, is well covered. In fact, she defers almost entirely to the demands of her ensemble, which seems to encumber rather than adorn her. The hat caps her head like a helmet. Her gloves, the left one, encircled by two bracelets, seem needlessly bulky. A coat or wrap is folded over her right arm, and she grasps a cane topped by a prominent bronze finial with her gloved hand, as if she is holding them for someone else. It occurred to me, maybe complete fantasy, perhaps these belong to the artist. The garment resembles the mustard topcoat he wears in his self-portrait with palette. Monet's model is the epitome of professional patience, with her sturdy, rounded body turned slightly but unmistakably towards us, a heavy chin set off by prominent black curves, and his strong arms. The subject will pose as long as the artist needs her to. She is alert but not inflexible. Her background is a scrim of gestural strokes of mostly white, gray, and muted blues and greens. Even though portions of what appears to be a lace curtain have been painted in broad, flat strokes around and on top of what appears to be of her hat, the curtain in no way challenges the primacy of this woman's smartly dressed figure. In contrast, Sally Fairchild's figure appears tensed with the effort of resisting movement. Her shoulders are set parallel to the picture plane without being thrust back for the purpose of maximum display, unlike those of her forebear, Virginie Gautreau, Madame X. Sally's arms press against her body, which, while partially dressed, seems somehow too present for comfort. When a person of average height faces the painting, which hangs about here, waist to waist, Sally's figure looms above. It's surprisingly large. Perhaps this is because the exposed primer of the lower half of the torso appears too much like flesh. Despite her erect posture and firmly set shoulders, Sally does not appear to be free. It has been suggested that Sargent posed her against a cliff. Tall, wild grasses and sparse trees covered the rocky cliffs and outcroppings that define the terrain of Nahant. There was nothing remotely like Sargent's undulating stalks of green and brown anywhere nearby. Yet despite the wildness, the background has an odd specificity to it. Sargent has distinguished the left from the right portions. Whatever forces were on the move on the left have quieted somewhat, and shapes that might denote buds, leaves, or flowers, very faintly there, emerge, I think, just a bit. Even with the occasional glimpse of the primed canvas beneath, Sargent's thicket of unyielding strokes to the right of the figure anticipate one of Henri Rousseau's thick, entirely fictive forests. And this is his dream at the Museum of Modern Art of 1910. The frame around Sally is both a borderland where her figure meets the world and a test of her ability to transcend it. Sargent's concentrated experiments with the boundaries of the social body had begun with Madame X, and he would pursue them in earnest until at least 1907, when they culminated in his portrait of Lady Sassoon, whose rose, silk-lined black opera cloak renders her a partial écorché, because it does look like the interior of a body. His large watercolor of Isabella Stewart Gardner, on the right, swathed in a protective cocoon, would be the last instantiation of this impulse, an exception made in honor of their long friendship. Virginie Gautreau's torqued figure had been encased in an armorial skin and a dress that could stand on its own. Sally Fairchild's representation offers a very different vision of young womanhood. The blue veil is an ever-changing aggregate of force and fragility. Sargent had the capacity to render fabric as a fragile membrane, as a fortification, Hilda in the center, or as a combination of the two, Adele Meyer. Sally Fairchild's veil may be at least partly transparent, but it is far too agitated to invite touch, a desire Sargent was entirely capable of inciting or rather maybe inviting, as he does in his representation of Mrs. Hugh Hammersley's lush salmon velvet ensemble. The rough, almost aggressive strokes that compose Sargent's idea of a veil discourage rather than invite touch. Some writers appear to have taken a certain pleasure in having Sally's reputedly beautiful face covered, as if Sargent had deliberately, even perversely, deprived his subject of her greatest asset. But I suspect that this is not what Sargent had in mind, although admittedly he was famous for not telling anyone what he had in mind, once the subject strayed from music, books, travel, art, or gossip, although he was a highly literary man and a very talented pianist. Sally remains recognizable, at least to those who knew or knew about her, as we do now. Perhaps the rose slash of cheek painted atop the veil suggests that a touch might be accepted if it were to come from the proper supplicant. Sally was reputed to have declined a number of marriage proposals. In the blue veil, Sargent has bestowed upon Sally Fairchild protection, femininity, gracefulness, and force, all in the same painting. In 1889, Claude Monet wrote to his wife, Alice, "Sargent's father has died. So sad. He loved him so much, and he was such a good son." Dr. Fitzwilliam Sargent, whose sort of unavoidably melancholy-looking portrait, is treated as a near irrelevant figure in most biographies of the author, but of the artist. But Sargent learned a great deal from his father, who was his first teacher about art and science. As the author and illustrator of On Bandaging, a standard, highly respected text within his field, a field of medicine which he had to abandon when he left for Europe, the elder Sargent, who died less than a year before his son began Sally's portrait, was a walking encyclopedia of how best to intervene in the wounded body. While healing the damaged body was his charge as a physician, Fitzwilliam conferred upon his bandages a devotion that went way beyond strict utility. Not only did the son and father share a preoccupation with human vulnerability, they were both intensely concerned with the fabricated and natural substances that could alternately mask and expose it as circumstances demanded. In their respective mediums, both men constructed surrogate skins to manipulate those boundaries. Both Fitzwilliam and John were obsessed with the materiality of their respective mediums. Dr. Sargent advised his reader exactly in Philadelphia where they might find the softest linen for bandages, while his son applied pigment with such force that boar's hairs from his brushes remain embedded in the surface of his paintings until this day. While the father emphasized the importance of direct palpation of the body to proper diagnosis and treatment, his son navigated the physical world to the sensation of touch. Sargent was said to touch everything that caught his eye, including the garments he chose and sometimes deconstructed. He was fully capable of ripping them for his sitters. A year after the blue veil was painted, Sargent met the Fairchild family in Paris, where grand performance of this predilection took place during his whirlwind tour he gave them of the Louvre. Lucia's diary records Sargent running his fingers over the Red Rose and a Madonna by Botticelli and grazing the surfaces of several of Ingres' portraits. He bestowed a special attention upon the passages that represented the subject's garments. Standing before Velázquez's Infanta, Lucia reported that, quote, "he touched a bit of her sleeve." Sargent decided that the Venus de Milo should be turned to a more flattering angle. He was stopped by a museum guard, but not before Sargent had laid his hands upon her. Lucia Fairchild liked to say that her older sister Sally, with whom she did not share a close friendship, was her goddess as a child. But how was this goddess to function properly in the world, as well-traveled and reasonably well-off as she remained, despite the disastrous loss of most of her family's fortune after the American Depression of 1893? She could attend the lectures of William James, whom we know she impressed. She shows up often in his letters. She could have dinner with George Santayana at Harvard, and Bertrand Russell, which she did. But where exactly was a self-educated, increasingly less well-off, unmarried woman to position herself in the early decades of the 20th century? Sally traveled with and later tended to her mother until Lily died in 1924. and then lived first with her younger brother Gordon, and later alone, with her uniformed, silent Japanese servant. Her family likes to tell the story of how in her 70s, and she lived until 90, she was named as a correspondent in a divorce case involving a man 30 years her junior. Sargent kept the painting of Sally in his studio until the end of his life. He could have finished it, but he did not, chose not to, perhaps deliberately. I would wager that the artist discerned in his subject a fellow traveler, whom he painted as having stopped somewhere during the stages of metamorphosis, between the cocoon and the butterfly she would never quite become. Thank you. And I'm happy to take questions. I even have a microphone here. I can walk around.
Yes, we have some people in the audience with microphones.
Let's see. Samantha did coach me on how to turn this on. I mean, which seemed so simple at the time. And I would prefer to be down here for questions, if that's okay. Is that okay with you, Caroline? Okay. Questions? Excellent. I don't have to do anything else. The book is written. Thank God. I was worried. Yes.
So I find it interesting that you're taking a painting that's unfinished and putting your spin on it, but I often wonder how you can interpret that if it's not finished.
Well, it's a question as to whether it's unfinished. It was, what's strange is that he painted up to a certain portion of the canvas. So he chose to stop painting. And the painting is now in a private collection. And it was first, I think, in the Terra collection in Chicago, and then it was briefly in the Newark Museum. And I think because it was regarded as unfinished, it was not seen as, prime Sargent material. So it was deaccessioned by both those places and put on sale, I think it was Sotheby's. And it is now in a private collection. Yes, I am putting my own spin on it. However, I think it's consistent with the somewhat less radical, but nonetheless dramatic materiality of the other paintings I'm writing about. And I think the one that is most dramatic is Lady Sassoon. And if I had details of that, I could show that. And I'm hoping, against hope, I think it might happen, that painting will probably be in Erica Hirschler's show on Sargent and Fashion that's coming up in Boston next year, because it's in a private collection in Houghton Hall in Norfolk, in England. It's in a private room of the house. So even if you're on a house tour, you don't get to see it. So Lord Cholmondeley has very generously given me many chances to observe it, but it's so yellow. It's so, it's been varnished, and it's never touched. So I imagine when the varnish is taken off, it's going to have the same effect that Adele Meyer's painting had after the varnish was taken off. So I'm hoping that that happens. But, I mean, it's an excellent question. And believe me, I've obsessed about the same thing. Because there's a tendency to see it as, inventive as one of his watercolors. But I think he was doing something different in that painting flesh on top of veil is something, a passage like that is present in all of the paintings that I'm looking at. So, thank you for the question. Yes.
Thank you very much for your conference. It was very interesting for me. I'm sorry for my English. I came from very far from here. And I'm not a specialist in these paintings, but I couldn't stop thinking about Whistler, and I wonder.
Who he was very good friends with.
Yes, and I wonder why you didn't mention, because you are doing kind of different relation with Monet, and I couldn't forget about Whistler symphonies in white, and especially seeing Lady Season and Palmer,
Sure.
about what you show.
Well, I would say that, I mean, of course, they were very good friends. Jimmy, Sargent called him, and they were such unlikely characters, because Jimmy was it was said that he was a painter of very delicate things, and had a real fierceness to him. Was not an especially nice person. Sargent, beautiful, nice paintings, but very silent. So it was an odd partnership. I would say, though, the distinction, and Sargent actually did move into Whistler's studio on Tide Street, that was Whistler's first, is the question of materiality and the simple fact of the density of the pigment, which is something that you don't see in Whistler. I mean, certainly, there's a lot of discussion of Whistler as a kind of proto-abstract artist. And I am interested also in kind of pushing against that seemingly severe boundary between them. So I have learned a lot from people who have written about Whistler and Whistler in fashion, Susan Galassi's catalog from the Frick, for instance. And I have actually advised, I think so far, 2, maybe 3 students on Whistler. So I think he's a sort of exploding subject. But I think Whistler came into being an important subject for modernists before Sargent. I mean, I think Sargent is still a kind of ambiguous subject for ambitious modernists to write about. It's happening. It's definitely happening. But it's only been almost like the past decade, 10, 15 years. And scholarship takes a while to come into the world, other than the 10 or 15 people who buy your book and the libraries. Yeah, thank you.
Gardner is really bandaged in this white dress and that watercolor and the bandaging itself of the veil. I wonder if you could draw out for us a little bit that evocative comparison. I mean, if we think of bandages in terms of healing and protecting flesh, or is clothing then kind of protecting these fragile selves, or how do you see
I think so. I think so. And the phrase physics of touch came out of a conference where it was a medical humanities conference, which is sort of the other thing that I do, in which I talked about Fitzwilliam's book and Sargent's painting. And just, Richard Shaw, a literary scholar, came up to me and said, "Oh, I really liked your talk. I've been thinking about the physics of touch." And then suddenly it was, "Oh, it all fits together." But my husband did say, "Really?" when I told him this. But, and has been supportive all the while. But I think, yes, exactly. And there's so much discussion. There are many, many books and wonderful pieces on skin, surface, within anthropology, within cultural studies, history of medicine. There's Claudia Benthian, there are sort of cultural histories of skin. So I definitely use those. And then I use the work of anthropologists who talk about fabric, materiality, and skin. I see a real affinity. And I think that the story has always been that it was Sargent's mother, who he was damned if she was going to be a Philadelphia housewife, who got them going, unfortunately, after the death of their firstborn, out of the States into Europe. And I think Fitzwilliam had no idea that he was leaving forever. And it was basically tragic because he really couldn't act as a doctor outside America. And he continued to write, and his book came out in 4 editions. And the last edition has a kind of heartbreaking forward where it says, we have information here about wound treatment because it's, you know, after the Crimean War. Unfortunately, the original author was in Europe. So, you know, somebody else had to write that chapter. And I think that must have been very frustrating. He was apparently a very, people call him forbidding, but I think it was just melancholy, but he was so devoted to his son. And I think his son was very devoted to him. So I think it's all one thing. And if I could tell you the stories of these various people, I mean, their lives are really, they are at a moment in their societies where they're all people who are being looked at, really scrutinized, and sort of mercilessly. And each one of them, around the time of this painting, is going through some kind of difficulty. You know, whether it's a divorce scandal, whether it's a betrayal of a love affair, whether it's bankruptcy, isolation. It is, as I've said in my quote-unquote lightning talk, it's the challenge of the project. How to make what to me is a theoretically risky project fit with all the primary materials I have, which I have never had so much primary material. It's tricky, because I don't want to do it in a heavy-handed way. It's not just straightforward biography. I want to talk about this very issue that you brought up of vulnerability, of people who are dismissed as being invulnerable. So, I don't know if that answered your question, but. Jill, would you like a microphone?
As I was sitting here looking at these beautiful, beautiful paintings start to change as you describe them, they really do seem to start to move, and in a way that they're, what would seem to be figures that are done seem to start to undo themselves and shift.
Beautifully put. May I steal that?
Oh, sure, absolutely. Okay. So in that process, I all of a sudden recalled this talk by Hortense Spillers this summer in Berlin, and Hortense is Black feminist scholar, titles One Wants to Steal, you know, Mama's Baby, Papa's Maybe, you know, one of the best titles ever, an American grammar book. And she's also embarking on a project that she describes as profoundly risky and understands to be in some ways the book of her life. And it's a book around thinking touch. But thinking touch in terms of the history of slavery, which seems not irrelevant here. No. In that she's concerned about the ways that a version of how we account for touch could seem like it's always healing, redemptive, erotic. There's a striking line that I'm recalling that I hope I don't mangle about how personhood is constituted out of the capacity to claim a right to refuse to be touched. And I wondered about that flesh that's on the surface of the veil and exposed flesh that also seems in a way withdrawn, and wondered about becoming claiming in a way, or being constituted in terms of personhood by being painted to, in some way, have a capacity to refuse the touch that one also seems to be inviting.
That's a beautiful way to put it, and I would like to, you'll give me the reference, because I would like to know it.
Yes, of course.
And I'm sure that's, because, you know, say, Sargent, we don't really know exactly about his sexuality. The assumption is that he was gay. And Trevor Fairbrother wrote a beautiful book, a catalog exhibition, Sargent the Sensualist. And it's convincing, but we don't have any information. And it's a fact that he would touch any object that he wanted to paint or that he was really interested in, but not really people. And so I think it's very complex, but absolutely the problem of touch, that's a very interesting way to think about the veil, flesh on top of the veil. So thank you.
Sure. Thank you.
Do you paint yourself ever?
Not particularly. I used to draw pretty well, but I had nothing really to say in that medium. I have a daughter, actually, who's a visual artist, and see right here. It's a whole different thing. Actually, there's a wonderful interview by Charlie Rose with Kirk Varnedoe, in which he talks about this, which probably many of you have seen, because of course he's a Williams person, about why he became an art historian. Because a question that we're often asked is, well, or assumed that we're failed artists. But he talked about that he didn't have anything, he was, adequate. He could draw, he could paint, but he didn't have anything to say that way. And I certainly felt that way. I mean, I went from, pre-med through, psychiatry, art therapy to art history. Okay. Oh, thank you all.
I apologize.